where he's a postdoctoral research fellow. His research interests include the later Stone Age hunter-gatherer rock arts of Southern Africa and the performative practices they involved. He works closely with the rock art itself, as well as ethnographic and historical evidence to study the social contexts in which the making and viewing of images was socially significant in the pre-colonial past. I'm going to just read the abstract for anyone who didn't get it. So Southern Africa's San or Bushman rock art is some of the best understood globally. In this region's rich ethnographic records combine with highly detailed images and sophisticated social theory to reveal how the indigenous image makers thought and lived. The enormous advances in the shamanistic interpretation of the art since the 1970s are well known, but more recent research has focused on the close relationships between the different forms of San expressive culture observed by anthropologists, such as trance dances and storytelling, to better understand more about now unobservable rock art practices. These performances brought meaningful concepts into being. In this talk, Dr. Witelson will present his new book, Theatres of Imagery, a performance theory approach to rock art research, in which he uses rock paintings from the Eastern Cape's Stormberg Mountains to understand some of the interactions between image-making performers and their audiences on which society itself was contingent. Thanks very much. We look forward to hearing your talk, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen, and you can all see that. Is it coming across?
Yes, I can see that.
Wonderful. Great. So good evening to you all. Thank you very much for joining us here. It's a very cold evening in Johannesburg. I can't imagine that most people are much warmer. So I hope you've all got blankets and hot waters and hot drinks. I'm a member of the northern branch of ARCSOC here in Joburg. So it's very nice to be speaking to fellow members of the Archaeological Society. My name is David Witelson, and as Patricia said, I'm Rari at WITS. And my talk today is about how theory helps us understand more about rock art. I'm talking about my PhD, which was 2 years ago, and then I published it at the end of last as an academic monograph, and you can see the cover of that on the side. So just to give a brief outline of the talk, I'm going to talk very, very simply about the book, and I'll introduce the study area, the Woodhouse district in the northern part of the Eastern Cape. I'm going to say something about performance theory and introduce some basic terms and ideas. Then I'm going to come back to the sequence, the older paintings and the most recent paintings in the Stormberg and how we understand that. And there I'll talk a bit about the famous Southern artist, Walter Battus, because even though he was also inspired by South African rock art to make some of his own prints, he conducted several studies that he published, academic that he published, and those haven't received as much as I think they should. And then after that, I'll come back to the paintings themselves and some ideas about how they were made, and tie that all together with performance theory. So this is the book, Theatres of Imagery. It's new theoretical approach to the art that hasn't been applied in Africa before and is relatively rare globally. And it's also got new paintings and pictures that haven't been discussed in publications before. So there's quite a lot of new stuff in. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive. BAR, who is the publisher, the British Archaeological Reports, publishes these lovely monographs, but they're expensive, particularly expensive if you're trying to get them in South Africa. One has to pay shipping as well, and then extra costs because it's not posted. It's got to come with here. I've tried to organize cheaper copies to be sold locally, but so far that hasn't come to fruition, but I hope it will. If you are interested, if you go onto the BAR website and look up the title and then create a free account, sorry, my slides seem to be changing by themselves, then you can get a 20% discount. So if you are interested, do look it up. The Stormberg is a really wonderful place. I've said, it's in the northern part of the Eastern Cape. And we've got on the right, you can see the little square. The Woodhouse Magisterial District is an administrative boundary, and it's just one way of constraining the number of sites that I was looking at. And you can see those sites over on the right, the green dot. The area or the biggest town is Dordrecht, and it's way between Aliwal North and Queenstown. So if you travel through the Eastern Cape, you can have a look. The Stormberg is a beautiful place. It's quite rugged. The geology is a little bit different from the Drakensberg proper. It's the southern extent of that famous escarpment, and it's a beautiful place to work. Lovely valleys and hills, and impressive landscapes. I'm doing this work. It's also very impressive in summer with the summer rain, the thunderstorms in summer. They're quite impressive. You can see some of the pictures here. One of the reasons that it might be called the Stormberg is because of this impressive phenomenon with the thunderstorms. But there was also an indigenous person, probably a speaking person called Storm, who lived in that area, and it's possible that this range is named after him, but it's really not clear. But it is clear that there's a lot of impressive rain, and we certainly have a lot of rain-related images that are painted in the rock shelters in the Stormberg. The field itself was quite enjoyable. I was fortunate to work with Ben McLennan, who runs the Anderson Museum in Dordrecht, and has been documenting rock art sites for over 30 years. He lives about 40 minutes outside Dordrecht, and he was able to take me around to things I wanted to see, introduce me to various landowners, and the field would have been much more difficult without him. The fieldwork itself involved visiting the sites myself, taking lots of high resolution digital photographs, spending time looking at the paintings, and then taking those photographs back on the screen, running various enhancements on them to bring out the colors and to make sense of what was going on. And I did some of this work with some students. See the two young men down in the bottom right-hand corner, first-year students who came from Oxford University, and they were able to join me for some of the fieldwork and learn about rock art fieldwork in the process. The fieldwork also involves some tracings. So here you can see some lovely marine animals surrounded by some fish, and we produced a tracing of that. The tracing, this method does not damage the paintings in this area. The rock art is fragile, but this technique doesn't damage them. And so we continue to trace them very carefully by hand, and then produce digital drawings from that. And more the process is becoming digital, which I think is an important development and expedites a lot of the process. So there you see some various steps of that process. Excuse me, there's some frequently asked questions. Sorry, the slides are moving of their own accord. I don't quite know how to get past that. But anyway, frequently asked questions. Most people will know, anyone who knows about art or has attended a kind of field trip. People want to know how old the art is. Then they want to know how did the artists make it and why they make it. And then they want to know what it means. And these are common questions. And although we have others in research, these are the kinds of things that Guy was saying. And I think we need some new questions. And I'm going to address some of these in reverse order. So starting with what the art means, know that most of the art is the art of image making owners of potency. These are ethnographically, we know that they are members of the community who are healers, mediators between different spheres, between this world and the spirit world, between humans and animals and spirits and so on. And most of the art seems to be made in the capacity of these people as mediators, social mediators, cosmological mediators. And particularly in the southeastern mountains, in the Drakensberg, have quite a lot of representations of these people. of potency. We can identify them by the various things that they carry. In the grayscale photograph there, we've got some lovely fly whisks. These are only carried, as far as we know, by the owners of potency, and that, although the scene isn't shown, it belongs to a big trance dance. And then we also find paintings of the dancers themselves, and bits and pieces of the dance that help us understand and contextualize a lot of the in terms of this social and cosmological mediation. We're also very, very fortunate, as Patricia pointed out from the abstract, that we rich resources in this country, in this region of the world, that a lot of other places don't have. So we have a mutually illuminating relationship between documentary sources, the archival material related to Bushman peoples from the 1700s onwards, when Europeans started writing things down, and then some of the art. And so we've got detailed written record, people who belong to the group. Detailed written records and detailed art, and we can put these things together. So by way of example, about healers bleeding from the nose, we're able to go to the art and find some examples of people dancing and bleeding from the nose. On the far right, you can see the photograph with a rather chubby white figure, and it might not come out very clearly on his nose, and he's touching an eland. The eland is a very important animal, both sort of biologically and in terms of the survival of hunter-gatherers in southern Africa, and then symbolically in terms of their belief in the social world and so on. And then we're able to put these things together in the, you see the photograph and the black and white drawing at the bottom of the screen. That's the famous panel in Pass, where we have a dying eland and a figure who is touching the dying eland, transforming into the eland, or an eland or antelope, and then seems to be mimicking some of the dying aspects, like the cross legs of the eland. So we're able to understand quite a lot of this stuff. And so when it comes to meaning, we understand not necessarily specific meanings, but we understand the principal ways in which the art was meaningful to the people that made it. And a lot of research, certainly not all, but a lot of research since the 1970s, when the questions about meaning, or rather the answers about meaning started to become more interesting, that research has concentrated on matters of meaning. So we have on the left there, an understanding of the central ritual, on the right, the central ritual, the healing dance, the trance dance, this communal activity where healing occurs, and the owners of potency travel between this world and the spirit world. And then we also understand a lot of the symbols, like the eland, which is central in the sense that it's important in almost all aspects of life, in hunting, but also in transformation and healing and looking beautiful and initiations and marriage and so on. So it's an important thing that has lots of ripples and resonances across different aspects of society. The book has concentrated on what I like to call meaning in action, or performances. So rather than focusing on necessarily trying to discern some of the meanings, because that kind of work has been done, not that the work is finished, it has taken us forward somewhat. I'm trying to look at the art, the meaning, how meaning operates in the art for the people that are making it. And there, I think performances, the concept of performances is helpful. So that brings us to this question of what performance theory is, and why bother using it. Simply, it sounds lofty, performance theory, but very simply, it's a way of approaching things that could be defined as performances. You will have encountered, I think we all will have encountered the word performance in different contexts. You might be assessed for how you are performing at work. You might go to see a performance at the theater. You might see a rehearsal of a performance, and you might hear about performance in high performance technology, high performance cars, that kind of thing. All of different ideas have something in common, and that's what performance theory is dealing with. And so we've got under that heading things like theatre productions, rituals, sport, and human interactions of all kinds. Incidentally, there's a kind of evolutionary thing here. If you think of birds and mating rituals, there is an element of performance. So those are the kinds of things that come under this performance theory. I work with the definition of someone called Richard Schechner. He's an American theater director and a performance theorist. And he wrote that, or according to him, the definition of performance is that it's an activity done by an individual or group in the presence of for another individual or group. And even when audiences deny, he says, when they're not physically present, as with some rituals and play, the function of the audience persists. What does that mean? Well, it means that even alone, you might do something because you're thinking of how someone might perceive what you're doing. One example is prayer. There is an audience there. When people pray, they pray to God. They're expecting God will receive prayer, and there's a kind of interaction there. But God need not necessarily be physically present in the same way that our friends and family might be. So that's the kind of thing he's talking about. And I think performance theory gives us useful terminology to think through some things we already know, to rethink them in interesting ways. So performances involve performers, the people doing things. Then we have the audiences, the people that are observing or sort of participating in what the performers are doing. There are interactions between these two groups. They have a display by the performers of whatever it is that they are doing. And then we have the audience who assesses that, makes some kind of judgment. And that's where there's an element of risk. The performance can go wrong. It can be bad. The audience might not like what's being done. So all of this is nice, helpful words to help us take our thinking about rock and image making practices forward. So I find all of this particularly interesting because we know there are lots of performances in what called San expressive culture, those aspects of San society like music and that involve an expression of beliefs and ideas. We know that the trance dances, the healing dances are performances and involve kinds of relationships between performers and the audience. We know that storytelling, histories, accounts of hunting events and travel, those are stories performed by a storyteller, and there's a group of people who listen to the storyteller and might engage and participate or tell the story in their ways. And then we have things like initiation rites, where girls become women and boys become men, and various things that need to be done to facilitate transition culturally in terms of how those people recognize men and women and so on. So we've got all of these performances, and they been studied, and so we really understand them quite well. It differs a little bit with rock art, and my question is whether it wouldn't be good to group rock art under the umbrella of San expressive culture along with all other things. And to do that, I think we need to have an argument that it is performed in some way. And this is what I suggest it is. I think making rock art, as it were, is a performance. So over on the top right there, you see the little cartoon. And unfortunately, people think of painters and artists, and certainly rock artists, tendency, although not everyone thinks this way, but there's a tendency just to imagine the artists as we imagine the artists that are familiar to us, people with brushes and different color palette and an image, and perhaps slightly funky clothes. And that's as far as it goes. But performance theory takes us a lot. We have to think about who the images are for. We have to think about what the artist is trying to achieve, both maybe at an individual and a cultural level. So it gives us more to think about. So coming back to the rock art itself, I think because we have people that are presenting images, highly visual culture, something that seems necessary to be seen. Okay, it's not invisible, it's highly visible. And so I think we've got observers as well, the people coming to look at the art, but remember that they need not be physical. We might have gods or spirits who are the final arbiters or the judges of whether the performances work. So we're not limited to these words, even though they might not be the best description of the kinds of things we're thinking about. But I definitely think that we've got an activity following that definition of performance. We have a definition helps us understand, the activity as being something that is done by an individual or group, one painter, many painters, in the presence of and for another individual or group, whether that be the community, people that are in contact with each other, or gods or spirits. And I think importantly, what we have is image making owners of potency who are displaying as part of their performance technical skills, their abilities to make images, to make art, if you want, through painting and engraving and so on. And then we have, with that, the display of their spiritual skills and their capacity as social and cosmological mediators. So all of this comes together, and I think we've got performance. So thinking in terms of performance theory gives us another question to add to the ones that we've got. Instead of just saying, how old is it? How was it made? What does it mean? We have a new guiding question: for whom were the paintings made? And that takes us a little bit further. So I'm coming now to the painted sequence, and we can pause briefly to admire this wonderful painting, or this wonderful photograph, rather, of Walter Battus in his very funky hat and his intense eyes. So Walter Battus, most of you will know, was a South African artist. He's particularly well known for his prints and the creation of Fook Island and kind of escapist ideas that came with that. There was a recent exhibition in Joburg at the Wits Art Museum, some of you might have seen. He wrote a series of publications, in addition, as I said, to being interested in art as an influence for in rock art as an influence for his own art. He published several studies, and one of these was The Artists of the Rocks, which he published in 1948, very important year in the history of South Africa. And in this work, he presented a three-phase sequence for South Africa's painted and engraved rock art together. Unusual to do it that way, but he did. And this material has been relatively ignored since it was published. It got I think it got some attention from one or two people in 1949, but since then he's been mentioned in passing, but very few people have engaged with his ideas and what he said. Why? There seems to be some indication that it's because he was an artist. He wasn't a scholar. He certainly wasn't a trained archaeologist. And he dabbled in this stuff, but I'm not sure that he was taken seriously. I think he was an unusual character, and some of that, his reputation as an artist, meant that archaeologists didn't engage too profoundly with his work. Nevertheless, he had this idea about three phases, sort of old, young, and something in the middle. And he had the idea that the art changed from one phase to another, particularly because of the migration of the Bantu-speaking peoples. Now, his idea is not something we accept anymore, but he suggested that there was a Bushman population who made rock paintings or rock images, and they had to move because the Bantu-speaking peoples were coming south, and they in turn displaced another group of people who had made images before them. So again, we don't follow that, but ideas about movement and displacement and change in art, those were popular ideas at the time. So that was how Battus was thinking. And importantly for me, he illustrated his argument using a shelter from the Stormberg, where I was doing the PhD. Incidentally, I discovered Battus's work after I'd done a lot of the field work. So it was quite interesting to see how he had thought about it in terms of what I had encountered. So I'm going to tell you something about his ideas before I come to mine. Okay, so his first period he called the early period, and he referred to these as prehistoric faded eland. He said that these were painted on the best surfaces in the shelters. Why? Because in his thinking they were blank, and then the first artists arrive and they chose the best spot. I don't think there's any evidence for this whatsoever, but that was his thinking. He noted that there were no human figures. He described them as faded, but actually they aren't faded, they haven't lost color, they're just covered in dust and various other things. But he noted that they were unshaded polychrome eland. That means there's no blending of the colors, but there are multiple colors. And these were reds and browns and thick permanent whites rather than kind of thin flaky stuff, and a little bit of black, but not much. And the question that was asked about his sequence was where are the older layers, the stuff that comes before they're more than one color? And the reason for this question is that we have it in the Drakensberg, but we don't seem to have it in this region. So is it an issue of preservation or occupation? Does it mean that the images were there, but at some point in the past they all disappeared? Or is it because the people that made them never lived in that area? And we just, at this point, don't know. Then he describes what he calls his middle period. Unfortunately, I should point out that he didn't illustrate the pictures in his book, but I've relocated the sites and the panels, the images, the specific images he was talking about, but they're not necessarily photogenic. So you can see those images in the center here. Even with the digital enhancement, it's not particularly clear what's going on. But he described for this period shaded polychrome animals. So now we have an attempt to blend and create a kind of three-dimensional realistic effect, and some creatures like eland and also human figures. He noted that there was a slightly different color palette, maroon reds, often shading to white, and not much black except in the horns and hooves. And then he also thought that this ended in a kind of terminal phase, and that you can see over on the right, where there's very little blending, and in the close-up in the bottom right there's a little bit of mixing of the white and red that he thought might indicate a separate phase. I don't think that's right. I think it's a result of wet paint mixing unintentionally, and I'll come back to that later, the different paint recipes. Then he had what he called the late period, or the Bushman period, meaning the images made by the Bushman groups who were known to European colonists. And he noted for this art that in contrast to the older stuff, in his sequence, there were new wild and domestic animals, new human groups, people with cattle and spears, people probably pastoralists or agro-pastoralists, not merely hunter-gatherers. But I think it gets particularly interesting because he noticed that this was a completely different way of painting, very different management of the color and a different color palette. So instead of blending the colors, we have sharp edges between colors, nice boundaries between yellow and white, for example. And then we've got bright and flat colors, yellow, white, red. The reds are not maroon, but brick red. We've got yellows and oranges that at least become more prominent in the sequence. And then the whites are very bright, they're not creamy. And then we also find lots of black images. You might find whole scenes that are painted in black. And I think some of his ideas are really worth some more attention. So I think he came up with a very interesting way of thinking about the ages of the art. And I don't think everything he said in the sequence was right, but it's worth giving him the attention and the recognition that it deserves. So I just want to read a passage from his book. He wrote that the subject matter of the art, whether it was people or animals and so on, he said that alone can determine whether it is Bushman or not. Now, he means not ethnically or culturally Bushman, but in that Bushman phase that he's describing. And he notes that wherever there is a painting of an ostrich, that is Bushman art, and wherever there is a painting of a baboon, that too is Bushman art. The reason, he says, is that these are the favorite forms of the Bushmen in that period, and they do not appear in the art of other periods. In other words, he's noting that these are new things that you don't see in the older art. And he goes on to say that so obvious is the Bushman subject matter that it is hardly necessary to mention the undeniable stamp of representations of Bushmen themselves, the Bantu-speaking peoples, Europeans, cattle, sheep, horses, and plant forms, all of which is kind of more recognizable in comparison to what he's talking about, recognizably more recent. And so he says, in another way, the color combinations used by the Bushmen plus the subject matter determine other paintings, so that whether they look very old or new doesn't matter. And I think this is actually quite profound, given that he was writing in 1948. He's saying it doesn't matter if the images look like they're old or new. he actually has a descriptive way of thinking through that, so that even when you find an isolated image, if it is different enough in these described categories from another image, you might say, well, it's probably a bit older or a bit younger. We don't know the precise age, but it gives us a way of thinking about it. So I think Battis deserves credit for that work. And he had a number of other key observations. One was that he paid attention to the relationship between pigments, the stuff that gives the color to the paint, and binders, which bind the pigments together, and you can then use it as a paint. Those aren't the only ingredients, but he paid attention to them. And he noted how they influence one another. He paid attention, as I've pointed out, to the color use and management. And he pointed out that the most recent paintings have the exact same appearance posters done in the silkscreen process. If you don't know what that is, it's the kind of thing artist Andy Warhol used for his pop art. And here you can see and the different colors are areas of color. There's no blending boundaries between them. And he was thinking about it in those terms. I think it's quite a helpful description. So coming now to my work, the field work that I did, I found shaded polychromes, the like eland antelope, and far fewer but still shaded human figures. And what's interesting is that the other kinds of paintings are never underneath. The hard edge, brighter colors are always on top. So we can have some confidence that this stuff is indeed older. I also didn't find evidence of the stuff that people thought might have come shaded red eland that you get in the Drakensberg. So we don't know why, but this seems to be the oldest stuff in this area. Then on the other end, we have hard-edged paintings. And here you can see a photo just not deteriorated at all. And it's unusual, but at the same time, it's entirely consistent with the color palette, the subject matter, the way these animals are painted. So I don't think anything funny is going on here. We've got this hard-edged phase, and we see the different colors, the management of the boundaries between colors. And then we have other subject matter, like people with shields, agropastoralists with spears and pack oxen and sheep. Seems to come from the contact period when we have African farmers and herders further south. Interestingly, there's another phase that received attention, and that is what I call the late shaded polychrome phase. And what's interesting here is that we have domestic animals, new animals that are painted in the shaded polychrome technique, the older technique. And we know very few examples of this. We've got one in the Free State and one in the Eastern Cape. But it's clear enough that there's some kind of transition because it's new subject matter in the old technique. It may be a stepping stone between these phases. Quite interesting, and I think deserves more attention. So this table is very busy, but if you just focus on the two red columns over on the left, you have what I think is going on. We have a shaded polychrome, as I've said, and then this transitional stuff, and then the hard edge phase. And these match aspects of other sequences that have been proposed in the southeast and the kind of general Drakensberg area, but it matches the characteristics in the Free State, and it's quite interesting that there too we don't have some of the stuff, and we do have evidence of these shaded domestic animals. So I think that's the sequence, and there's more work to be done there. The variation regionally, even in a fairly bounded area like the Drakensberg, there's a lot of different things that seem to be going. Seem to be the oldest from the dates that we've got, the direct dates that we've got. They seem to be about 2,500 years old, and these are coming from black that have been dated by people like David Pierce and Adolphine in Canada. Then we have the late shaded polychromes. We've got no date kinds of paintings, but because of the nature of the subject matter and the technique, it's going to be within the contact period from 2,000 years ago, probably up to around 600 years ago. or around that time, not up to, but around that time, because when we begin to see the earliest evidence, at least in the Drakensberg, of contact reaching the interior parts of the country. But it seems to evidence the earliest domestic animals and their keepers, at least in that part of the country, not necessarily for the region as a whole. And then we have these paintings, and those have to be relatively recent. And part of the reason for that is because I think some of the changes in the color are related to contact and the introduction of things like yellow and orange from Sumatra peoples, and I'll return to that. And then, of course, the most recent stuff is dating to the colonial period, where we've got European things like and European dress and ox wagons, and so quite a long sequence in this part of the country. But I haven't worked with the colonial material. So coming back now to the question of the audience and a bit of performance theory, we've known for a very long time that the art changed in the context of what might be called cross-cultural engagements, or simply contact between different groups. But some of the details of that change needs more attention. We know that subject matter changes. You get different kinds of things painted, different animals, for example. The color palette changes, and this is something that has been described but not really thought too carefully about. And I paid attention to that in my PhD. And then we've got what seems to be a change in the painting technique as well. And it's particularly interesting because there was an argument published by Jannie Loubser, who now lives in America, in New York, but was working at the National Museum in Bloemfontein. And he suggested that, and remember that he had the same sequence Free State, it was Jannie's work. He suggested that the reason we have these changes is perhaps because once you get farming and herding communities moving south, they move into areas where hunter-gatherers were and take over particular resources like pigment mines, and the hunter-gatherers need to move to places and find alternatives. So he suggested that the change in the pigment, the actual stuff that colors the paintings, led to the art change. And I think although I certainly think there were some changes in the pigments, on its own doesn't really explain all of these other things. It doesn't explain change in the color, although it might, but it certainly doesn't explain the changes in subject matter, what's being painted. And so there's more to think through here, and I think performance theory color palette. Can you still hear me?
Yes, so we can still hear you. I also wanted to just
thanks.
add, if the slides are changing still without your authority, apparently on the left-hand side of your screen, apparently there's a pause button that you could be able to use to pause the slides and just change them one by one. Someone pointed that out. But other than that, you're still clear. I think everyone can hear you still. So yeah, you're still enjoying it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we've got the introduction of new colors like yellow. They come in end of the shaded phase, and it's quite interesting to say, okay, well, we know the changes, but why? And I think it's got something to do with the color symbolism. In other words, the meaning of yellow, and where does the significance of that yellow come from? Now, I should point out that what I'm saying now, concerns yellow southeastern mountains. I think we have a completely different situation in the Western Cape and the Southern Cape. The geology is different, the social connections are different. So I'm not looking across South Africa or even Southern Africa. I'm talking specifically about the southeastern mountains around Lesotho. And so what's interesting is when this yellow comes in, it's not enough to say that people started using other sources, because the sources were always there. Red and yellow tend to come together. Would you find them together in the same places? So I think there's a social reason that this is shifting. So where does that come from? Well, as I've said, perhaps it's a change in color symbolism that comes about because of the interactions between different groups. And you can see the map over at the top. Those are all sources of yellow pigments of which we know. Various other things like people who use yellow pigments. And the color symbolism is associated with power and the properties of eland, also with honey, the color of honey, and then things like felines, which have yellow manes and so on. Then we have the color symbolism of yellow for Bantu language speakers. It means it's associated with royalty, beauty, military prowess, and also things like felines. So we've got overlaps, common ground, and for things to spread. They're not opposed. And particularly for Bantu language speakers, we've got the Botswana and the Basotho, related and linguistically related groups who use yellow and orange ochres more than most other groups. And they use it for body decoration and building decoration, painting houses. The body decoration is interesting. In the vicinity of and Kuruman, we have records from the 19th century of people from these groups, the Tswana groups, painting themselves with yellow ochre. But it's royal children, royal women, and tree people. So it's a really important in those contexts. Virtually no other groups use yellow in that way. The materials they use cosmetically to treat the skin or pimples or something might be yellow, but not being used in a symbolic way. And so what we might have here is a spread of ideas. In the Stormberg area, we have lots of yellow paintings. I've shown a couple of them on the there. But it's very, very, very rare to find local sources of. It's possible, but most of the stuff is grey and the red of the Elliott Formation. So difficult to find yellow, but we've got lots of yellow paintings. So where is it coming from? I think the geology is interesting and the social connections. But for the moment, I think where the Tswana groups in South Africa historically existed, excuse me, were up in the northern parts of South Africa, Kuruman and Postmasburg and so on. And we have the biggest deposits of iron ore, hematite, red iron ore, in the world. And that's still mined at places like Sishen. But where you have a chemical alteration of that red iron ore, you get a mineral called hematite, which is yellow. And because we've got the geology there and the social significance in the ethnographies, it's possible we have that yellow moving down to the Stormberg. We know that there was a pre-colonial trade route. This is something that we know groups, Tswana groups, who would move down to the Orange River and then sometimes go west to trade with herders at the coast, or go along the river to the right, all the way into the Eastern Cape. And we know that it's a very long, very widespread trade route that was very important and began to collapse with the beginning of colonization in South Africa. So I'm to test some of these ideas, and I'll do it chemically with Adolphine Bonneau, who's in the dating work. I'll do that in Canada next year. So coming now to the other change in the painting technique. We've got these hard-edged paintings where we have no shading between the colors. And this is quite different. Is there more to it than simply a change in pigment? And I think there is. I think we have new paint recipes, different combinations. This will result in a change that may not necessarily come about because of the change in the color or the kind of pigment. So I'm going to talk about two different kind of binders here. That's the thing that holds all the pigment together to make a paint. I'm showing you two close-ups here on the right of shaded polychrome paintings, and you can see the brush strokes in this, which relates to the nature of the paint. And I think what we've got is a kind of oil paint. About different kinds of paints in the Western world and Western artistry. An oil paint is a mineral generally mixed with plant oils like linseed oil, and we know what the properties of this are, and different recipes have different advantages on what you're trying to do. So oil paint is great because it's slow drying. That gives you time to blend colors and shade them before the paint dries while wet. The film itself can be glossy to matte. And you can see strokes in the film, for example, as we've got in these two pictures. And you add the binder, when you add the oil to the pigment looks wet and it doesn't change that wet looking color. In other words, if you start with a bright red and you add the oil and it goes a darker kind of wet red, when the paint dries, it keeps that, lose it, because the binder doesn't evaporate entirely. And I think one is fat from things like antelope in San culture. The eland is venerated for its fat, very important. And chemically, oils and fat are similar, so you can produce a similar kind of paint. A different kind of paint is generally in the Western world is tempera. And there, instead of using fats and oils, you use proteins, things like blood, egg, or milk solids. And the properties of tempera paints match the properties of the hard. So they're quick drying, meaning that you don't have enough time to blend the colors. If you want to have different colors, you've got to layer them on. You've got to, for paint white, let that dry, then put the red on top, and you have your nice areas of color. And the paint film is always matte. In other words, it's got a kind of powdery finish. It doesn't look like it's part of a shiny varnish or something. I apologize for the typo there. In rock art, the paintings usually aren't varnished by the image makers, but they are varnished in the Western world. And because of the nature of this protein binder, it evaporates completely, and the dry pigment loses the kind of wet appearance when the binder evaporates. In other words, the bright pigment that you use at the beginning, a little darker while the paint is drying when you mix it with the binder, but then when it evaporates, it goes red. And you can see that in the bottom left there, the lovely red-orange with the white neck. And it's amazing because we have from the Drakensberg area a painted stone made by a Baputi man called Mapote. He painted, the stone is at Wits if you want to see it. It's at the Origin Center Museum. Painted these red figures and the red animals using blood, and we know that he did. And so we've got that resembles the tempera paints. I'm not suggesting these paint recipes were simple, but I do we can distinguish between different kinds of paint, even before the chemical analyses. So how do we bring all this together with performance theory? I think we talk about why and how the art changed. And we know, said, that it was in the context of contact, different groups coming into contact with one another, but we don't necessarily or haven't yet started thinking too much about what those mechanisms were. And I think performances are those mechanisms. We have different groups of people in new situations who are adapting to what needs to be done or to what the audiences want. And that ranges far more than it does for the pre-contact hunter-gatherer art. But it still applies. So I think dealing with the bits and pieces, the intricacies of performance help us understand some of the changes in the art. And essentially what I argue as part of this work that I've done is that we have new audiences for image making and composition of society at a grand scale post-contact. You no longer just have a hunter-gatherer world with hunter-gatherer groups who are more similar to one than anyone else. You've got farmers and herders coming in who are really quite different. The interactions start to change things. Sometimes people come together, they fight one another. Sometimes they marry across these boundaries. They have to speak each other's languages and so on. And that's going to have a knock-on effect for different kinds of needs and wants for these performances. And so we've got new social realities, and I think it's in that context and via performances that we're getting some of the changes in the art. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, David. That was a very interesting talk. I didn't know about all that changes in the artwork through time. It's very interesting. Have we got any questions from the audience at this point? See this comment from Nick. Wonderful, lovely to your talk.
Thanks very much, Nick.
So those defined rock arts, I'm quite surprised that there's no indication that they were painted over again or something. That's just how they were painted and they didn't weather. The ones with the
Yes,
very bright colors.
I mean, it is astonishing because they've preserved quite well. Even when we don't have particularly well preserved examples, we can see color palette, the kind of thing that Walter Batters was talking about. We can go, okay, we know where this is. There is some degree of repainting, and eland images will be painted one on top of another. Sometimes you have 4 of these things. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example where we have, you know, the different kinds, the different styles, different attributes can be lumped under style. But unfortunately, term in South Africa because people have different meanings. But I can't think of examples where the different layers of individual deliberate layers painted one on top of another from one style to the other. But no, there doesn't seem to be too much repainting.
Okay, cool. Very interesting. Any other questions? Another comment of wonderful. And thank you, David. A lot to ponder on.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming.
Right, yeah, thank you to everyone for joining us. And I'm sure you can get in touch if you have any other questions that you think about afterwards. Thanks again, David. It was really great to have you. And yeah, have a great evening further.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming.
It's too late.
No.
Is there a question from?
Yeah.
I'm just going to stop the recording so long. I think Jean and Paul, there might be a question.
Yeah.